Tell you that African leaders are pushing for reforms at the UN Security Council to reflect where the world is and not where it was 80 years ago. I'm now joined by legal practitioner Femi Ojumu to look at Africa's quest for a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. Thank you very much, Mr. Ojumu, for joining us.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you.
Let's begin with just basic knowledge of what the role of the UN Security Council is in maintaining global peace and security, and then more extensively, why Africa representation is crucial.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think the first point to make, though, is that the UN comprises of several organs. The UN Security Council is one of them, and is by far the most important in terms of its function, in terms of its power, and in terms of its ability to compel the enforcement of its resolutions. So it's got the lead policy role and enforcement role for global security. So it's a really pivotal body. That's the first point to make. The second point to make is that the representation on the UN is dominated by the five permanent members, veto-wielding powers. Not one of those countries is an African country, which is a huge concern. I'll explain the rationale behind that, but that just gives you some context, if you like. Okay.
I didn't quite get you as to how crucial it is for Africa to be represented via a permanent seat at the UN Security Council,
all right,
considering its crucial role.
Well, yes, it is pivotal, and it is absolutely essential that there's an African representation on the United Nations Security Council, the world's most powerful decision-making body, because it has the power, the legal powers, to enforce its resolution and want peace globally. Now, Africa, the second largest continent in the world, okay, and home to approximately 1.5 billion people, has no representation on the UN Security Council, where most of the resolutions impact the lives of Africans on a daily basis. Okay. It is what we call a complete derogation of basic democratic principles. It makes no sense in the 21st century.
Some people have actually used stronger words to describe this lack of a representation, but we'll come to that and explore your thoughts on it. But for now, I want us to look at the fact that there is an agreement by the five permanent members on Africa's need for representation at that level. So what really is the obstacle? I know at some point a committee, way back as 1993, a committee was set up to look at the general reforms of the UN, but nothing seems to be coming in this regard.
Well, I think there's been a lot of rhetoric. So we've had a lot of talking, but very little action. There's been a lot of inertia. It is not rocket science. It is blindingly obvious as to why Africa needs to be there. As I said, it's the second largest continent. It is home to approximately 1.5 billion people. And the case that such a vast continent and a huge swathe of the world has no representation on this powerful decision-making body is absolutely counter to basic logic. It just cannot make any sense. So I think, in direct answer to your question, there's been a fundamental lack of political will. So the Big Five and the Secretary-General need to up their game and be demonstrably proactive in ensuring that Africa gets a seat there. And again, it's about merit. You know, we can't in the 21st century determine the basis of representation on the UN Security Council purely on account of you being a nuclear power. You know, we've gone beyond that. It just defies logic. There's got to be some nuanced thinking, democratic credibility because it's one thing for the United Nations to talk about war, peace, democracy, the rule of law. But at the UN Security Council itself, what we have is a complete vacuum of democracy in the representation, the equitable representation of all continents. So Africa not being there in the 21st century makes no sense whatsoever, and it needs to change. In other words, stop the rhetoric, execute the action now.
Okay, while we're looking at this push, I want us to, on the flip side, we are Africans. We know some of our shenanigans and how we tend to fail in rising to responsibility. But to be fair, we're about 54 African countries now that are UN members. How prepared do you think this continent is to take on the responsibility of a permanent seat?
I think that's a fabulous question. And I've heard that argument made several times before, that, oh, Africa is not ready, there are capacity issues. Well, the counter argument to that is that we've had great African statesmen lead various organs of the United Nations. I don't need to reel out a long list. We had Boutros Ghali, the former Secretary-General. We had Kofi Annan, the former Secretary-General, in the height of the crisis when the very basis of the United Nations was called into question. I'm talking here about the Iraq War of 2003, where there was global antipathy for the so-called basis of the war, which has been described by scholars as an illegal war. We've had Africans who've led the organization in various respects. We even had the Nigerian General Joseph Nanvan Garba, a retired external affairs minister in the 70s and an active participant in the Nigerian Civil War, who was at the time the president of the UN General Assembly, amongst others, the likes of Professor Adedeji, Yusuf Maitama Sule. You know, we can reel out these names, you know, some of the finest brains and intellectuals this country has ever had. So the notion that Africa is not ready, I think that's a really lame argument, and it's completely and utterly unsustainable.
For fear of saying I'm biased, I do believe that Africa has what it takes to have that permanent seat. But we're not the only one looking for it, are we? There are others who are wishing to get that position so that they can be part of this global decision-making body. What do you make of that? Do you think that, for instance, a country like, I'm not sure which of the countries now, just for reference purposes, there are countries that want to be there permanently, but as a continent, which should be paying more attention, are these countries supposed to maybe come together and push for the continent of Africa to be on the seat? And then we're still talking about independent countries.
Well, I think the starting point really is that the democratic deficit, which is completely undermining the continent, the entire continent, is unsustainable. And yes, we've got the rotational presidency of the Security Council, but when we're talking of real power and the capacity and the real veto-wielding power, that's only in the hands of the big five. How and why in this day and age should Africa be completely removed from that? It just defies logic. It makes no sense whatsoever. So the case is urgent, it's pressing, and it's compelling.
Okay, I want to reference a presentation by a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Pretoria at the, just on August 12th here. She presented to the UN Security Council. Her name is Sit-hem-bile. She highlighted 3 reasons for Africa's deserving of 2 permanent seats. One of them is historical injustice repair, recognition of Africa's contribution to global peace and security, as well as securing the legitimacy of the UN, which some people say is rather shaky at the moment. Do you align with these points that she put up? And how would a permanent seat, for instance, address historical underrepresentation for Africa?
Right. Well, the issue of, I mean, she raises very important points there. We cannot, in my humble estimation, hold current generations vicariously responsible for acts of previous generations. So Africa must deal with African problems and global problems as it sees them today, proffering the right strategies, diplomatic solutions, partnerships, and all of that. Okay. Of course, there is history, and we cannot disconnect from that. I've written extensively and spoken extensively about this. You only need to look at the basis on which the UN on which the UN itself was founded in 1945. Before that, we have the League of Nations, which of course collapsed in disgrace, because at the end of the 19th century, we had the scramble for and partition of Africa. We had the unprovoked war in Abyssinia, okay? The unprovoked war in Abyssinia, where Emperor Menelik, completely ravaged Ethiopian troops. And back in 1935, Mussolini, the Italian dictator at the time, invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia, without provocation whatsoever. Now, the League of Nations did nothing. So those injustices led to its collapse. Now, the UN has some fundamental questions to address here. Of course, there are issues of insecurity, genocidal wars in various places, poverty, multiple deprivation. So there are real challenges, but these challenges seem to be felt hugely in Africa. So the notion that Africa will not have a seat or two on the UN Security Council, where decisions impacting the lives of Africans are being taken almost on a daily basis, it's counter to logic.
Okay, there's a part of that question. There's a part of that question I'd like you to really pay attention to and possibly give us your thoughts as well. And that's the legitimacy of the UN, and in this case, the UN Security Council. There's argument that the UN Security Council faces credibility concerns due to maybe some inactions, like you've highlighted. They don't actively respond when they need to. Where has the Council fallen short? Let me start there. And how do you believe African representation at that level will help maybe refocus the decision-making bodies to some of these issues that you are neglected, that you highlighted?
All right. Thank you very much. Another great question. I think first I'll set out the context here. And the context is that the 5 powers that ratified the UN Charter are today still the 5 most influential, most powerful veto-wielding members of the UN Security Council. No change there. In terms of how and why Africa will make a difference on the Security Council, we also need to understand fundamentally that the Security Council is about, well, not Security Council exclusively. Foreign policy, the essence of foreign policy, is about projecting, securing, and advancing your nation's geostrategic, geonational, geo-economic interests. So if you like, all the members, all the UN Security Council permanent members are doing that, which is why when there's an issue, a fundamental issue of right and wrong to the minds of rational people, there could be a veto. And the basis for that veto being exercised is the national interest of a particular country. So you have the balancing acts going on between the Western powers, you know, the likes of America, the United States, United Kingdom, France on the one hand, and you have the counterbalancing powers of the likes of China and Russia. Okay, so in those major dynamics, there's a lot of realpolitik. Okay, the question then becomes, what happens to African interests? Because Africa is not just a bystander here, a continent with 1.5 billion people. Their views matter. We have wars in Africa. There's crisis in Nigeria, with ethno-religious terrorism claiming, and we just claimed thousands of lives over the past 15 plus years. And go to Sudan. There's genocide going on there. Then we go to places like Palestine and other places. And therefore, you're like, well, how can it be that Africa doesn't have a role? So the argument I'm making is that with an African representation on the UN Security Council, with veto-wielding powers, full powers exercised by the Big Five, then there should be, or there will be, a greater ability and capacity to influence decision-making at the highest level, which will impact positively, I proffer, African interests.
Okay.
So that's a simple rationale for that.
Okay, I want you to respond to this one as well as quickly as you can. We're almost out of time due to that earlier break. There are critics arguing that expanding the UN Security Council could compromise its efficiency and effectiveness. Is that an argument that you condone, or do you think it's an overreaching and an excuse not to give a due representation to Africa?
Thank you. With a greater respect, it is an argument, but I think it's a completely supine argument. How can you say it is going to impede the efficiency of the UN Security Council when 1 billion plus people have no representation? And the United Nations itself in its charter talks about the rule of law, talks about equity, talks about justice, talks about fairness. Where is the equity? Where's the justice? Where's the rule of law when Africa has no permanent seat representation on the UN Security Council? No, that argument cannot stand.
All right, what would be your words to African leaders in their continued push for this representation at the UN Security Council? And should that become a reality, what should they have in mind?
Well, they should have in mind, number one, commonality of interest where possible. It won't always be possible, but in terms of seeking out the best deal in terms of justice, the rule of law, democracy and its dividends, and ensuring fairness, security, cooperation, that's what they really should be talking about now and in the future, and pulling together to ensure that this aspiration happens. And what we don't have is just a load of rhetoric again. We don't need rhetoric, we need action, and action now.
Action now. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate your insights. Yeah.
Okay, super. Cheers.
Permit me to paraphrase a presentation earlier referenced by senior lecturer Sit-hem-bile of the University of Pretoria. She submits that by 2045, when the UN turns 100 years, Africa will have 2.3 billion people, making up 25% of the global population. Young Africans will be the world's workforce and consumer base, fueling the global economy. Will the membership of the Security Council be drastically different from what it is today by then? My hope is that the necessary work will be done so that the world has a UN Security Council that truly represents the interests and perspectives of all humanity. Thank you for watching thus far.